I really like Star Wars, and when Star Wars converges with tabletop wargaming, I get really excited. I remember back in the day, a couple buddies of mine texted me that they're playing this game called Star Wars X-Wing and if I wanted to join in, and I texted back, give me a couple of hours. I drove right to the store, bought armfuls of it, took it to their house, tore open those blisters, and played X-Wing all night long. And that was a space game. In 2017, it was announced Star Wars Legion, a ground miniatures game. Oh, and I knew immediately upon hearing that it existed, that I would one day own it all. Every faction, every model, I needed it. And I am well on my way to achieving that goal. I have a massive Rebel Alliance army, I've got a ton of Imperials, and I'm working on some battle droids right now. Now that I'm heavily invested in Star Wars Legion, it's about time to put together a terrain board. But that comes with a bit of a sticking point, because a lot of Star Wars terrain is really cool, but really, really specific. Naboo would be such a cool terrain board, but then every fight is taking place on Naboo. Same with like Coruscant, or Dagobah, or Tatooine. I don't want to be locked into a really specific location. I want to be able to fight battles anywhere, as long as it's a long, long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. With that idea in mind, I've got some terrain that fits that idea to a T. This terrain is buildings and supplies perfect for a sci-fi setting, featuring buildings of different shapes and sizes with plenty of room on top for minis to stand on and space inside with a really clever sliding door system. These buildings are perfect for blocking line of sight and restricting the movement of non-repulsor vehicles. This set also has pallets and crates for creating nice barricades and providing a nice skirmish zone for squads of infantry to battle through. We printed these in FDM, so they are very nice, very strong, and printed perfectly with some very clever engineering. This set was made by a guest creator, Corvus Games Terrain, an incredibly talented maker specializing in gaming terrain. This set, the Faraway Galaxy Bundle, will be on our website only for the month of July. Subscribers can get a discount, and we have other cool things on there too, like wet pellets, decals, and basing toppers and bits. And if you're interested in this set, you can find it at EonsOfBattle.com. And check out Corvus Games Terrain. They have lots of terrain too, designs like Old West, Superhero, Grim Gothic, and they have some new dark designs for Trench Wars, for anyone looking to put together a hellish warscape. To get my terrain ready for painting, I loaded it all up and took it outside to get spray painted. I gave each piece 2 coats of filler primer and then a coat of gray spray paint on the buildings and brown on the doors. The filler primer creates a skin over the plastic that hides the layer lines, and I used gray so that the final product won't get too dark. To get started, I took some gray paint a few shades lighter than the spray paint and a big ol' sponge, and I started stamping this on everywhere. The sponge won't get into the nooks and crannies, leaving those areas a little darker and will create a nice crunchy texture that'll add more detail than was already on the models. Once the sponge layer was on there, I took a big old dry brush and dusted all the minis with white paint. This highlights all the edges and brings attention to all the panels, frames, and pipes and details. This will be my base layer, a nice gray Durasteel. Now it's time for a little accent color. I grabbed some painter's tape and started cutting off some small stripes, and then I put these around all the doors, ladders, and some of the panels. I find a full strip of tape is hard to get lined up properly, so doing the first pass with little strips is a lot easier to get them lined up nice. Then I can fill in all the large sections with big pieces of tape. With the tape on there, I did a little more masking, this time with liquid mask. This goo is the perfect thing for paint chips. I picked it up on a piece of sponge and started stamping this on. I let these little flecks of silicone dry on the model, and after painting, I'll be able to pull these away, leaving me with real paint chips. Now that I have everything I don't want repainted safely masked, I grabbed a dark red and started blasting. In a few spots, I didn't feel like masking was necessary, and instead I used a playing card to protect those spots from this new color. After this darker layer, I took a bright saturated red and started sponging this on. This will keep the texture I laid down before going on these accent parts. Then to finish it off, I did a dry brushing of a light orange to hit on all the high points. This also desaturates the red a little bit, which is good. I find terrain should be a little bit drab so that the minis really pop around the terrain. Now I can do the best part, demasking. It's really satisfying to see the tape peel away and reveal the perfect lines underneath. It took a little while to get the tape on, but it only takes a few seconds to take it off. And speaking of taking it off, I grabbed a wad of the dried liquid silicone and used this to rub along the red airbrush paint. This grabs the silicone and lifts it off, revealing the perfect layers underneath. Masking tape is a great tool and I have a lot of experience with it. One trick is when coming up with a pattern, it helps to start out with really thin strips so it's easy to see what you're putting down. You have to think about the negative space and the positive space. For the top of this octagonal roof, I want an octagon with another octagonal stripe, and I don't want to do any measuring because that involves numbers, and I don't want to do numbers if I don't have to. So laying out thin strips will help me fine-tune this pattern by eye. When I come up to a corner, I overlap the strips, and then for the top overlap, I can score right over the tape so I don't cut into the surface of the plastic, and then to finish it off, I cut along the outside, getting a perfect corner. If I use a fresh blade, I can cut with so little force that I barely leave a mark in the plastic. Pretty good for eyeballing it. Now to fill in the middle, I took some bigger stripes and laid these on using the first line as a guide. On one half, I did a pretty good job at overlapping the corners, so I can just cut off the excess and leave myself with a perfect edge, and on the other side, I had to add an extra strip so I can use that strip as a cutting guide. With the tape done, I can demask, and here it helps to remember how I put the tape down. If I can pull the tape off backwards, then the overlapping sections will peel off in one go, otherwise you have to go one by one. Then I went back to my silicone booger and started rubbing. This adds a lot of wonderful realism and helps the design look like it's in scale. I kept on demasking, revealing my two-tone buildings. A few minutes ago, they were toys wrapped in tape, but now, in just a few seconds, the buildings are looking like real buildings, ready for the battlefield. The buildings for my little Star Wars settlement or town or mining operation or whatever I decide to use this terrain for is done, and I really like how it turned out with the red accent. I didn't really pick red for any particular reason, and I think it would have looked good with any color kind of replacing it there, but it reminds me of one of my favorite Star Wars things, a little video game called Star Wars Galactic Battlegrounds. That game came out in 2001, and part of the reason I love it is because it's from 2001. That was right after The Phantom Menace, but it was before Attack of the Clones, and so the art style of the game was very Art Nouveau, where like Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith kind of got very like cosmopolitan modern in the styling of Star Wars, but it's like my favorite era of Star Wars art, and in the game, you could pick your faction. Also, factions were Guns and the Royal Naboo, along with the other cool Star Wars factions. But you'd pick your faction and then you'd pick your faction color, and all of your units and buildings would superficially change to that color, and it looked a lot like these buildings. Like I painted them red, but if I had picked blue, all of the red parts would just be blue and that'd be the only difference. But it did give them a little bit of a different look, and these buildings really remind me of that game. And I still play that game from time to time. It's an okay RTS, and I think it's still on Steam for like a couple of bucks. It's worth a couple of bucks. Now for those doors. A lot of things in Star Wars are brown, and I always wondered why. Not a lot of other sci-fi universes use brown as a color, but it does feel very Star Wars-y. I started off giving each door a little blast of tan paint right in the center of each door, and then I lathered on some tan speed paint to bring out all the little details in the door. This looked okay, but it didn't get as strong of a vignette as I wanted. I wanted to look really dirty around the edges of the door, so I grabbed some burnt umber ink and airbrushed this all around the center of the door to get those edges dark. I slid these into place and my buildings are done. Now onto the palettes. I love a good palette of stuff, and I found the easiest way to get them looking good fast is with some speed paint. First, I blasted everything with a black prime, and then I did a zenithal of white from above. This will give me my highlights and shadows all in one. Then I started picking out all the different types of boxes, one by one, hitting all the matching sets with the same color. First, these mouse droid looking boxes I picked out in a cold gray, and then I moved on to some yellow and hit all the cylinders. I'm pretty sure these are full of the soda concentrate that fast food places put in the fountain machines. Then I mixed up a warm brown, mixing some dark brown with orange, and I put this over all the big boxes. This is a nice burnt brown that reminds me of the brown accents on the droidicas. For the tall skinny boxes, I'm using some black speed paint, and on the little lunch boxes, I use some tan. Using the speed paint like this gives me a nice look, taking advantage of that zenithal while making sure I only have to paint everything once. Now for the palette. I made up a gray paint and glazed this over all the flooring. Keeping this paint watery will help it flow off the brush onto the ground. Then I made up a watery black paint and wetted some paper towels. I glazed this all over the ground and then came in with those paper towels to pull off the excess. This darkens the gray and sticks around stronger in the recesses and gives me that contrast. Since it's flat, I can't rely on the zenithal. After that was dry, I did some dry brushing on the ground with some light gray paint, doing some circular motions to really hit on all the textures in these palettes. I feel like in the world of Star Wars enjoyers, there's two camps. There's those people who are really into like the Jedi and the story of what's happening, and then there's my camp, the people who really like the world. Just the grittiness, the greebling. Star Wars invented the term greebling for the very specific look of the Star Wars universe, which is a lived-in universe where things aren't polished and clean like in Star Trek. In the world of Star Wars, you need things like extension cords. It's a world that really shows itself on its sleeves. I got these palettes full of cargo, and this would work perfectly in any sort of a Star Wars narrative. You always gotta be bringing stuff in or taking it away, and it just makes it really easy to build the narrative. And that's kind of what you're doing when you're setting up terrain, is you're building the narrative, the story that's gonna go along with this event. I've got a bunch of buildings and a bunch of boxes, and it'd be nice to have something, a nice piece that demonstrates what's going on here, something like a vehicle. This little cargo hauler will be the perfect thing to show how all these boxes got here. It prints in two halves, and there's a little clip to make sure it goes together perfectly. I sandwiched it in between lots of super glue and it was ready for painting. I started out with a heavy dry brushing of some gray paint, and then I mixed some more white paint into this mix to highlight all the edges. Then I broke back out the masking tape. I made two stripes running down the bed of the speeder, and I hit those spots with a base coat of white paint. Then I blasted them with orange. The white base coat will help keep my colors vibrant. Gray base coats tend to desaturate. I did a sponging yellow paint over the orange to hit on all the edges, and then a sponging white paint over everything to make it look suitably beat up. Now I want to add a little bit more weathering, so I hosed it down with dark gray and used a wet paper towel to wipe this color off the raised areas, leaving it in the cracks. This darkness overlapping the orange will help it blend in. And to make it look a little bit more lived in, I sprayed on some antelope brown, which is a really good color for generic grime. I squirted this on and then used a damp paper towel to pull it off. For the control panel, I base coated the screen with a white paint, then I hit all the buttons with some red paint. I gave the white screen a puff of white paint through the airbrush to make it look glowing, and speaking of glowing, I grabbed my Ghillie-Doo speed paint and airbrushed this over the white to get a nice sci-fi green. I used a brush to paint on the grid, and the vehicle is ready to float. It came with a base, and I sprayed this black and then stuck it on underneath. Now, the only thing left is the barricades. I want to give these guys a tan look, so I started off with a nice warm speed paint, and then did a little dry brushing of tan over top. Then I grabbed a little piece of sponge and started stamping on some dark brown. I made sure to get a few clumps on each side in preparation for some more weathering. I took some orange enamel and put down some drops at the bottom of each pile of brown, and then I used a clean brush to drag the paint down into rust streaks. Then I hit all the barrels and containers with some black speed paint and gave these a dry brushing of gray. I've got a bunch of buildings, I got a bunch of boxes, and I got a bunch of barricades, and it's time to put together a nice Star Wars scene. Speaking of scenes, there's a pretty big Star Wars scene at my friendly local game store, and also Sean, my mortal enemy, has a couple of Star Wars Legion armies, all unpainted. Leave a comment below telling him to get on it. I knew I would love Star Wars Legion. Coming from a 40k background, Legion is a very modern feeling wargame with some really clever rules, like random activations and a D8 damage system. I'm a sucker for fancy dice. It's Star Wars Galactic Battlegrounds in real life. It looks just like the game, and it kind of just looks like Star Wars. It looks like every other episode of Star Wars Rebels. I am ready to select no more than 64 soldiers at once because that's all you could do in the RTS from the early 2000s, but this is some nice Star Wars. And I feel like it doesn't have to be Star Wars. It's kind of generic sci-fi enough that I could play on any world in the Star Wars universe, but I could probably also get away with like a 40k mining colony or a little infinity mining colony or any sort of mining colony from any universe. Probably not Blood and Plunder, a 17th century naval game, but maybe I could make it work. I've played a few games of Star Wars Legion, but mostly like old school Red Solo Cup and phone book boards. Never some really, really nice looking boards. It's always so great when you can really play a miniature war game the way it was meant to be played, with the nice thematic terrain that perfectly matches the minis. You got Boba Fett diving off of a hovercraft. Like this is Star Wars Legion. I got my Rebel Alliance, I got my Imperials, I'm working on my battle droids, and I actually do have some Republic models, but not clone troopers. I got Wookiees, because you can take Wookiees in a Republic army. All this terrain is made by Corvus Games and is available from Eons of Battle at eonsofbattle.com this month only. Okay, I gotta get Sean working on his armies.